simple. I think that the logical problem of evil, and even the evidentiary problem of evil, are some of the most powerful rhetorical devices for disproving the Christian religion. Now, notice the careful use of words there. I didn't say disproving the existence of God. I said disproving the Christian religion, because the Christian religion is a series of propositions. And I believe that the logical problem of evil demonstrates a necessary logical impossibility within the propositions that would make Christianity a true religion. And what are these propositions? Well, they're as follows. A God exists, and this God is omnipotent, meaning all-powerful, can do anything. Omnibenevolent, meaning that he is morally perfect, all good. Nothing which would be not good exhumes from this deity. And then finally, he's omniscient. So he knows all things, all true propositions, including all future events. Now, I've already, in a previous video, sort of touched on the absurdities between omnipotence and omniscience. So we're not going to be focusing on that right now. We're going to be focusing on omnipotence and omnibenevolence. And for the past 2,000 years, Christians have tried desperately to get out of this problem, this logical problem of evil. And most of you will have been familiar with the Epicurean paradox, which goes as follows. If God is willing to prevent evil, but unable, well, then he's not omnipotent. If he's unwilling to prevent evil, but he is able, then he's malevolent. If he's both able and willing, why is there evil? And if he's neither able nor willing, why call him God? Effectively, this argument demonstrates that it is incoherent to suggest that a being with unlimited creative power, also instantiated, who is also omnibenevolent, meaning morally perfect, instantiated a world that was not perfect. You see, Christian apologetics up to this point in history have always been about trying to gaslight people into accepting that everything that we observe in the universe, all the evidence that we've ever acquired or tested or measured or analyzed, ought not conform to what is actually true. And what I mean by that is it's a task within Christianity. It's one of their fourthmost tasks to argue that an imperfect, malevolent universe is what we would expect to see if a perfect, benevolent God created it. Think about that idea in your head for just a moment. This is effectively what Christians are arguing when they argue against the logical problem of evil, right? Now, a lot of the times Christians will take up this mantle of arguing for just a generic deistic God, because for whatever reason, and I don't know why we've let them get away with this for so long, Christian apologists seem to think that the Epicurean paradox, the logical problem of evil, is designed to prove that no God exists. That's not what it sets out to prove. It sets out to prove that a God with the simultaneous characteristics of omnibenevolence and omniscience, or I apologize, omnipotence, doesn't exist. Now, omniscience does come into play as well. We'll get to that, but those two characteristics are what we need to focus on. Because a being who is omnipotent, by definition, has complete, sovereign, total control over all circumstances and conditions of the world. Whereas a being who is omnibenevolent, by definition, would not nor could not do anything which is morally imperfect. They could never arrange for moral imperfection in the world. They couldn't do evil, so to speak. So, now that we have these definitions straightened out, now that we're aware of what we're talking about when we say the logical problem of evil, it is just merely an identifying the logical contradiction between the characteristics of omnipotence and omnibenevolence. Now, obviously, if you believe in some sort of generic deistic God who doesn't possess these characteristics, then this argument wouldn't apply to you, and Christians will often attempt to argue from that mantle, which I find weird. I wonder, is there a name for a fallacy wherein you argue for a position that you don't actually hold, but you get mad at the people you're arguing against when they are arguing against the position that you do hold? What's that called? Quandary for you guys to answer in the comments. Yeah, but no, seriously, Christians will often take up the mantle of believing in some non-defined characteristics of God, that he just created the universe simply, and they'll use that to try and weasel out of the logical problem of evil, because obviously nobody would argue that a God couldn't possibly exist if evil exists. right? They'll pretend as though this is just merely an emotionally charged argument wherein we're like, oh, if this being has all this power, why does he make us suffer? It's far more complicated than that. And you're going to see how complicated it gets when I go through each of these responses. And I've decided to rank them by most popular to least popular. And what I mean by that is the ones I hear most frequently and the ones that I hear very rarely, if at all. And this playlist, as you've seen, is titled Thwarting Theodicy. Theodicies are the branch in Christian apologetics that deal specifically with arguing why the perfect, all-knowing, all-powerful creator of the world decided to instantiate a state of affairs of non-perfection, malice, hatred, spite, pain, suffering, agony, terror, and so forth. Why that was the foremost of his predilections at the time. Well, let's deep dive into it, shall we? What is the most popular argument against the logical problem of evil? Now, I'm not saying this is the most effective. I don't think any of them are effective, so obviously it wouldn't be genuous of me to argue against theodicies based on which ones I think are the best ones or most effective. I think they all fail miserably and equally. So what is the most popular? Which one is used most frequently, I should say? And that would be the free will response. And what is the free will response, for those of you who might be asking that question? Well, it's quite simple. Christians will argue that evil must exist in the world because God gave us free choices. He lets us do what we want because he wants us to make the choice to love and obey him. And so we have to have the choice not to love and obey him. Okay. Now, at face value, that might seem like it's a pertinent argument, but when you actually dive into the context of it, it fails horrendously. Question number 1. Do people have free will in heaven? Can they make conscious decisions? Okay, well, if you answered yes, then here's another question for you. Do people do evil things in heaven? Could people do evil things in heaven? Okay, well, if you answered yes to that question, well then, what is heaven really? What's the point of going to a utopia where people can still be malicious and hateful towards each other? It doesn't really make any sense, right? Now, the bulk of you probably answered no, however. No, you cannot do evil things in heaven, but they might be tempted to say it's because you don't want to. Oh my goodness, I'm so smart. I predict their arguments when they're not even talking to me. Yeah, that's the idea. That's the way that Christians get out of this little question is you could do evil things in heaven, but you don't want to because you're always in the divine, loving presence of God. Okay, how is that anyway distinguishable from just not having the capacity to do them in the first place? Right? If God had just created us in his divine, loving presence in the first place, would we ever have wanted to do evil? Would it be an impeachment of our free will to not want to do evil because we're surrounded by this unconditional, magnanimous love? Really? Is that the way they're going? Because if that's the case, then they have a lot more problems with this argument than they're trying to solve. Yeah, obviously, if God, his mere presence is just enough to make us not want to sin, then why not show up, dude? Where you been? If it's consistent in the Christian worldview that this would not be a violation of our free will, then, well, there you have it. There's the solution. Just be here and we won't want to sin. We'll want to love and obey you, which is an interesting quandary in and of itself. Do we choose our desires, right? If the answer to that question is no, then what is free will anyways? Since most of us act in accordance with our desires, we don't have any volitional control over our desires. What's really the distinction? This becomes a broader conversation about free will and determinism, but let's just argue within the internal critique of Christianity. Let's just assume they're referring to libertarian free will. Okay. Well, so we've got that first situation down. We have free will in heaven, but we don't want to sin in heaven because God's presence or whatever makes us not want to sin. Well, if that's the case, then God could have just skipped the middleman and created us within his own presence, so we would have no desire to sin, and we would still have free will, if that's necessary for whatever reason. Aha, but the Christian might say, we only get into heaven because we made the choice to love and obey God. Okay, well, that's interesting. Alrighty. So, what about all the creatures that were in heaven that didn't choose that? They were just created there by default. Like Satan, for instance, or any of the angels, or any of the fallen angels, which Christians call demons. You had these beings, which were apparently perfectly capable of free will because they chose not to, obey him ultimately. Some of them did, anyways, and were cast out of heaven. But you had these beings, these cognitive beings, that were created with free will, the ability to make conscious decisions, and they were created in heaven. Okay. So, how does that track then? If you can only get into heaven because you made the conscious decision to love and obey God, well, these beings didn't make that conscious decision because you can't make decisions prior to your existence. So God created these beings. Um, their default state of existence was to be in heaven with Him or to be in some morally perfect realm. And then some of them made the choice that they weren't on board with this. They didn't want to follow God. They didn't want to be subservient to Him. And so God cast all of them out, including the ringleader, Satan. Now, of course, all of these entities had infallible knowledge of God and his characteristics and his properties, and they still made the conscious choice not to obey him. So it doesn't appear to be the case that, me being in the amazing presence of God actually takes away anybody's desire to be sinful or do morally imperfect things, or evil for that matter. So argument one fails miserably. I think we can all recognize that. The Christian refutation in this regard is utterly falsified. Now, what if they answer no to the first question? Is there free will in heaven, or do we have free will in heaven? Well, that's problematic for a few other reasons. So Christians, again, tend to ascribe to heaven the properties of being the most conceivably great place ever. There's nothing about heaven that can be further improved. It is a utopia. It is devoid of agony and sin and malice and evil and hatred and all that kind of stuff. It's the greatest place ever, and it'll be an eternity of absolute bliss, harmony, and peace. Okay. Well, if we don't have free will in that state of affairs, it would follow then that free will is not conformant to a state of affairs of love and goodness and peace and mercy and happiness and joy. So that would make free will evil. And thus, God giving us free will would also be evil. And God doing anything evil would contradict his characteristic of being omnibenevolent, now wouldn't it? If you're going to define omnibenevolence in any way that's meaningful, you're going to have to draw a line in the sand somewhere. Now, of course, I've mentioned before that in talks about Christian morality, they often say that goodness is just whatever reflects the nature of God. So effectively, when they say that God is omnibenevolent, what they're really saying is that God is all God, that he's the most like himself of anything out there, which is fantastically uninformative and frankly philosophically bankrupt. Clearly, that's not what anybody is referring to when they say omnibenevolent, because when Christians talk about benevolence, when they talk about goodness, they have in their mind and they articulate certain ideas about that, what it means to be omnibenevolent. And they ascribe to this deity characteristics like justice and mercy and compassion and love. Are those things that just all happen to be conformal with God's nature, or is that what you assume a being with omnibenevolence would emulate? Which way is it? Now, of course, if I were to argue that God was in fact really hateful and malicious and spiteful and evil, well, what would the Christian say to that? No, he couldn't do any of those things because that would make him not God. Which is really just a semantic argument to say that, if a being that possesses the power to create a universe and operates exactly the way that I would consider a God to operate, simply just doesn't possess the certain moral characteristics I prefer, I just wouldn't call him God. Okay, well, that's not a useful argument to make. We're still talking about the same thing, just without your preferred circumstances. So this being happens to be loving and merciful and kind and just and compassionate. But what do all of those things mean in reflection to the world? What would that look like in practice? According to a Christian, there's no set standard. God could literally do anything, and it would be all of these characteristics by definition. God kills the firstborn children of every household in Egypt, from the lowest of servants to the highest of lords. And that's considered loving, kind, godly, benevolent, just, and merciful all at the same time. Well, that's clearly incoherent. Christians will say that he did this because he was liberating the Israelites from slavery. He was freeing his chosen people, so that was a good thing. Well, I'm pretty sure that both you and I and anybody else with an IQ above room temperature could conceive of a few other ways that an omnipotent being with the power to literally create universes out of nothing could have liberated the Israelites from slavery without needing to murder innocent children. I mean, that's just, well, I think that would be a given, right? There are other examples of this sort of malicious, contemptible behavior in the Bible. And Christians just gloss right over it because they don't apply this weird standard of whatever they have of benevolence to those concepts. So when they give me an argument like free will, what the fuck do they even mean by that in the first place? Right? I mean, if you've already decided that God could literally do anything and it would be good by definition and therefore not contradictory to his will, why is the free will argument necessary? And of course, it would be because Christians don't actually believe that God can just do anything and it would be good by definition. They might argue that way, but sincerely, they don't think that. And they will articulate often the contrary of that when they talk about moral values and duties. They have an idea of what they think a morally perfect being would behave as, would reflect as, right? They have it backwards. They think that if there's such a being which could be considered morally perfect, then he would have the attributes of justice, mercy, kindness, benevolence, loving, compassion, so on and so forth, right? Those are all the attributes that they assign to a morally perfect being, not what it entails to be a morally perfect being. You see how subtle that is, right? It's not that they think that this being has a particular nature and this is the nature of goodness. No, they think that there is a nature of goodness and this particular being happens to possess that. Now, the moment that you do that, the moment that you take a real world application of what it means to be good or benevolent and you apply that to the Christian God, it becomes abundantly clear that this being does not behave in a way that any of us would articulate as good or moral or just or righteous. And if you're going to define this being as being both omnibenevolent and omniscient, I mean omnipotent, then I can logically conclude it doesn't exist. And the free will argument fails utterly. Easily the worst refutation to make. Now, a lot of you have also been asking me for longer videos, so I'm going to oblige here. We're already at about the 18-minute mark, I would say. Let's keep going. I want to address another argument, which I don't think I would need to make a full video about. This should only be a few minutes at most. So right after the free will argument in popularity comes the greater good argument, that God did everything or allowed evil because it accomplishes some greater good. That is easily the most convoluted idea I've ever heard. Think about for a moment, if we were to consider that God is not omnibenevolent. Let's say he's omnimalevolent instead, that he's pure evil. Would it make any sense to say that he would allow some goods to accomplish a greater evil? No, that wouldn't make any sense because we recognize that good and evil are completely antithetical to one another. That allowing any good at all would diminish the greater evil. The greatest evil possible would be the complete and total absence of good. Likewise, the greatest good possible would be the complete and total absence of all evil. So when you flip these words around, it becomes abundantly clear that no, a being that is completely villainous, completely malevolent and evil would not allow any kind of good thing to occur just for the purposes of exacting a greater evil. Now, I'm sure that some Christians might have contentions with that. They might think of a scenario of like, well, what if the malevolent being wants to give us hope by allowing some good thing to happen just to crush it further on and create even more despair? How do you quantify something like that? How do you quantify despair? I think that if I'm living in a state of affairs ruled by a contemptible, morally depraved tyrant who has complete and total sovereign control of all circumstances and conditions, I think I would be at the epitome of despair in that regard. I don't think I could sink any further. The only thing, even false hope, the only thing that would give me would be a temporary relief from this infinite despair. So no, I don't think that my situation would have been any worse after the crushing of my false hope than before. I would have been equally in woe. So no, I don't think you can quantify that. Similarly, let's say that there's this child, and for whatever reason, God decides that His ultimate plan for the greater good, whatever that is, entails that this child be brutally abused by her father. Well, we don't look at situations like that and think that any good came of that. We have sayings like "my silver lining" or whatever. Every cloud has a silver lining, or you got to look at the good. And we say these things because we have to rationalize internally the unjustifiable horrors that are imposed on people all the time. And this God that Christians believe in would be imposing suffering on people at a scope and scale that would embarrass even the most ambitious psychopath. So let's be frank. No, the greater good argument falls off the horse immediately. I mean, we're talking about a being with unlimited creative power. If he wanted to, he could accomplish any goal he wants using any method. He doesn't have to employ evil in order to accomplish the greater good. He could just do it. He could just actualize the greater good. The same way that he, actualized heaven and actualized the universe out of states of affairs of nothingness. He's not playing by any set of rules or system. He's doing what he wants to do. And logically, since God, ontologically speaking, can't be compelled to do anything, the only reason why he does anything is because he wants to. And a being that wants to impose misery and suffering on helpless children, well, the only word I could use to describe such a being is evil, or synonyms thereof. So by every definition of omnibenevolent that would have real-world applicability, that would be meaningful in day-to-day conversation, the Christian God does not adhere to this definition in any capacity. And Christians have to constantly make these ad hoc excuses to get out of the problems that this definition seems to put on their God. But I'll end this video with a cute little syllogism for you. Just something to mull over, to think on. Premise 1. A morally perfect being would create or desire to create a state of affairs that is morally perfect. Premise 2. A state of affairs wherein only a morally perfect being exists would be morally perfect and therefore could not be further improved. Conclusion. Therefore, a morally perfect being in a state of affairs of solitude would not create anything. Premise 1, premise 2, conclusion. And I'll sum that up for you outside of the syllogism. Effectively, if there was ever a state of affairs where a morally perfect being was the only thing that existed, then that state of affairs was morally perfect. It couldn't have gotten any better because it was perfect. It was the most perfect it could have ever been. To do anything, to arrange for anything other than yourself to exist at that point, would be to act in the antithesis, in the contrary, in the opposite of moral perfection. It would be to go the other direction, and that would be evil, even according to the Christian worldview. If God's nature is one of moral perfection, and any deviation from God's nature is evil by their own definition, then when God arranged for things other than himself to exist, especially, now here comes the omniscience, especially with the infallible foreknowledge that all this stuff would be corrupted and the overwhelming majority of the cognitive beings that he created would be suffering in eternal conscious torment and fire, he intentionally decided to diminish the moral perfection of reality. He created a state of affairs that was not morally perfect on purpose, for whatever reason, and that by definition disqualifies him from being morally perfect. It disqualifies him from being omnibenevolent. It is not logically possible that a being could possess both the quality of omnibenevolence and the quality of omnipotence at the same time. They are directly contradictory to each other. So, argument number 1, free will, falsified. Argument number 2, the greater good, completely and totally falsified. Until next time, ladies and gentlemen.